By standing less than 1e-7 or 1/10 millionth of a block away from this wall, I'm able to step up the bottom block and jump, landing on top. This glitch was discovered by ZPIBoo, and it has two parts, 1e-7 movement and stepping. If your movement in an axis is less than the hard-coded value of 1e-7, that movement gets cancelled. You can do this by standing less than 1e-7 away from a wall. Let's zoom in on the collision process to see how this is happening in the code. Here's our setup, with the player being 1e-8 away from these two blocks. To move, the game does collision checks in each axis separately, first Y, then X, then Z. Or if you're in 1.14+, it depends on which axis you're faster in. So if you're faster in the Z axis, it'll be Y, then Z, then X. Here, in 2D, it will be Y, then X, but for this example, I'll ignore the Y axis. For each check, the velocity in the current axis is stored in a variable. Let's name it MVT. The game iterates over every nearby collision box. If MVT is less than 1e-7, it's set to 0. Then, if MVT would cause a collision with the current collision box, it's set to the distance to the edge of the box. For our setup, the game first checks for collisions with the bottom block. X movement is 0.1, which is greater than 1e-7, so we can move on to collision checks, where X movement gets set to 1e-8, since there's collision with the bottom block, and we're left with a movement vector of 1e-8, 0. Then, the game checks for collisions with the top block, and since X movement is now 1e-8, which is less than 1e-7, the movement gets set to 0, and we're left with a movement vector of 0, 0, so the player doesn't move. Having two blocks here is important, since the 1e-7 check happens before the collision check. To get an X movement of 0, you need a collision check to happen after you collide with the block, since the first collision check will set your X movement to 1e-8, and the second will set that to 0. If you just collide with one block, you get left with a movement vector of 1e-8, 0, so theoretically you should move against the block. But if we test this in-game, you don't move against the block. So what's happening here? This is where the second 1e-7 check comes in. After collision checks, your movement vector is stored in a variable. Let's name it mvt.distance. If mvt.distance squared is less than 1e-7, the movement is cancelled. This can be rewritten as mvt.distance is less than the square root of 1e-7. So in this situation, your movement vector is 1e-8, 0, and 1e-8 is less than the square root of 1e-7, so the movement gets cancelled. This second 1e-7 check is different from the first, since it's taking the movement of every axis into account. So even if we have a movement of 1e-8 in the x-axis, if we have movement in the y or z-axis, the movement won't be cancelled. Since the second 1e-7 check is a lot more lenient than the first, since it's the square root of 1e-7 instead of just 1e-7, people have found setups that abuse this check to float above blocks. By manipulating the player's movement so that you're less than square root 1e-7 above the block the tick before you land on it, the movement where the player lands on the block will be cancelled and you'll float above the block. For 1e-7 stepping, we only need to worry about the 1e-7 check that happens during collision checks. But don't forget about the second check, it'll come in handy later. Okay, now that I've explained 1e-7 movement, we can move on to stepping. The only reason this glitch works is Mojang completely changed the stepping system in 1.21. So let's look at the old and new stepping systems and see how they compare. Here's a simple setup for stepping, with a player moving into a slab. First we go through the collision process, where the player collides with the slab and X movement is set to 0.05. Then after collision checks, the stepping mechanic can be triggered. If the player collided with the ground, this or the previous tick, and if the player collided with the wall, this tick, we can proceed with the stepping process. In this situation, Y velocity is lower than 0, and the Y motion is greater than the Y velocity, so the player is grounded. The X motion is less than the X velocity, so the player collided with the wall. Since the player is grounded and collided with the wall, you can proceed with stepping. Pre 1.21, the game does this by first resetting the bounding box, moving the bounding box up by at most 0.6 blocks, moving it to the side by the player's horizontal velocity, and then moving it down by at most 0.6 blocks. Or in 1.14+, to stop blip-ups, moving it down until it reaches the player's height minus their vertical speed. Once we finish checking for collisions when stepping, we're left with a movement vector of 0.1, 0.5. Then the game compares stepping to normal movement. The horizontal distance of the movement vector is compared to the horizontal distance of the stepping vector to see which method yields a longer distance. In this case, the horizontal distance of the stepping vector is 0.1, which is greater than the horizontal distance of the movement vector 0.05, so the game does the step. In 1.21, the game resets the bounding box and searches for step heights by expanding it. The bounding box is extended horizontally by the player's velocity and vertically by the max step height. If the player was on the ground with previous tick, but isn't anymore, it's also stretched downwards by 1e-5. The game takes every collision box that is inside this expanded bounding box and lists the height of the horizontal faces that are low enough to be stepped on. The player then tries to step up each of them. For the top face of the slab, the player moves up by the candidate height of 0.5 and then moves horizontally by 0.1, which you can see gives us the same result as the other stepping system, so the step happens. The differences between stepping systems can be a bit technical, but all you need to know is pre 1.21, the game doesn't need to know where step heights are. It just moves the player up, to the side, and down. While in 1.21, the game first needs to find the step heights and then only moves the player up and to the side. Despite the 1.21 system being completely different from the old one, in most cases it will give the same result. But a problem arises when the player needs to step up a block below them. In order to make crossing diagonal gaps and crossing one block gaps possible, the expanded bounding box needs to take blocks directly below the player into consideration. That's why the game expands the bounding box downwards by 1e-5. It's basically a hotfix to pretend the massive changes to the stepping system didn't change anything. Now there's quite a few misconceptions about crossing one block gaps, probably because the popular video explaining them is wrong. Crossing one block gaps without jumping takes 2 ticks, since the player needs to cross a 0.4 block gap, and the max speed the player can reach is about 0.25 blocks per tick. In his video, Hepe explains the first tick correctly. First, the movement in the y-axis is set to 0, since there's collision with the starting block. Then, movement in the x-axis is calculated, and the bounding box is moved by 0.25. As you can see, because the player's vertical movement is calculated first, when you walk off a block, you'll float in the air for a tick. And because you collide with the ground, you're now considered on ground and are able to jump the next tick. Now, one thing to note, this is not coyote time. Coyote time is when a game intentionally lets you jump after you've fallen off a block. This is an unintended consequence of the movement order because the game thinks you're still grounded. It's very similar to coyote time, but it's not the same thing. Now we can move on to the second tick, where we have a problem. First, Y movement is set to 0.078 since there are no vertical collisions. Then X movement is set to 0.2 since there's collision with the landing block. As you can see, the player should fall and hit the side of the block, but if we test this in game, they end up on top. So how does Hepe explain this? He doesn't. He just kind of ignores the problem. Which sucks, because if he looked into it a little more, he might have figured out what's actually going on, which is stepping. Since the player was grounded the previous tick and collided with a wall, the game triggers the stepping mechanic. The game resets the bounding box and expands it. This is one of the cases where expanding it downwards by 1e-5 happens, since the bounding box needs to contain this block, which is below the player. The game detects the top face of the block as a steppable height, and tries to step up it. The game moves the player vertically by the candidate height of 0, and then moves horizontally by 0.25, and ends up on top of the block, which is a farther distance than the previous movement, so stepping happens. So that's how crossing one block gaps actually works, and why the stepping bounding box is sometimes expanded downwards by 1e-5. The 1e-5 hotfix works in most situations, but there's still one case where it fails. Crossing from a 1 block high block to a slightly shorter block like a path block is not possible in 1.21, since the expanding bounding box only accounts for blocks directly below the player. Now that I've explained both pieces, 1e-7 movement and stepping, we can put them together to form 1e-7 stepping. Here's our setup, with the player on a slab 1e-8 away from 2 blocks. Let's go through the collision process. First, Y movement is calculated. The bounding box collides with the slab, and Y movement is set to 0. Then the game checks for collisions with the bottom block. And since Y movement is 0, which is less than 1e-7, the game moves on to the next axis. First, the game checks for collisions with the slab, and X movement stays 0.1. Then the game checks for collision with the bottom block, and X movement gets set to 1e-8. Then the game checks for collisions with the top block, and since X movement is 1e-8, which is less than 1e-7, X movement is set to 0. Once collision checks are done, the player's movement is 0, 0. Now that normal movement is done, we can move on to stepping. The player collided with the ground and a wall, so you can proceed with stepping. There's only one candidate step height, which is the top face of the bottom block, so the game tries to step up it by moving the player X velocity 0.5. First, the game checks for collisions in the y-axis. There are no collisions with the bottom block or the top block, so movement in the y-axis stays 0.5. Then the game checks for collisions in the x-axis. There are no collisions with the bottom block, so X movement stays 0.1. Then there is a collision with the top block, so X movement gets set to 1e-8. So after stepping collision checks, the player's movement is 0.5, 1e-8. Because the bounding box moves up before moving to the side during stepping, it only collides with the top block, not the bottom. Because of this, the X movement of 1e-8 doesn't get cancelled, since the only block the player collides with is the last collision check in that axis. Whereas during normal movement, the player collides with both blocks, the bottom one sending the movement to 1e-8, and the top sending that to 0. So, stepping moves the player against the block, while normal movement doesn't. And because of this, stepping yields a larger horizontal distance than normal movement, so stepping happens. Everything about this glitch works with the old stepping system, but because the player gets moved down after getting moved up, you end up just moving into the blocks instead of moving up and into the blocks. Now that I've explained how the glitch works, let me show you how to actually do it. You need a block you can step up with a block over it. There needs to be only one block above the one you want to step up, since it needs to be the last collision the player has during stepping. There are two different setups to get 1e-7 away from the blocks. First, turn your sensitivity to on. For the first setup, you want to face directly in the axis towards the blocks, so your yaw should be a multiple of 90. Then, shift and press S for a tick. Then, just barely turn until your yaw is 0.1 smaller or larger, and shift and press W for a tick. Your movement backwards will be aligned with the axis, but your movement forwards will be slightly at an angle, so you end up just slightly away from the blocks. For the second setup, you want to face in an axis perpendicular to the blocks, so your yaw should be a multiple of 90. Then, face 0.1 degrees away from the blocks. Sprint forward a tick, walk backwards a tick, and shift backwards a tick. Once you've positioned yourself, you can walk forward and jump the next tick to land on top. Or if you don't want to time the jump, you can turn on auto jump and just walk forward. You can also perform this glitch twice in a row. By aligning yourself on the 1e-7 corner of two walls, you can step up one of them and then the other in the next tick. Unfortunately, stepping up twice is the max, since you'll move against the wall when you step up and no longer be 1e-7 away from the wall. You can also use 1e-7 stepping in a parkour jump by calculating the perfect position and player inputs. Ham Sandwich found setups for a 7 block momentum 5 block jump and a 1 block momentum triple neo. Another use for this glitch is floating midair. By landing yourself 1e-7 away from a block, moving directly forward and breaking the block below you, you'll float in place. Obviously, this is using 1e-7 stepping, but theoretically you should only float in the air for one tick, since when you step up, you move against the block, and you won't be 1e-7 away from the block anymore. So let's see what's happening in the code. Here's our setup, with the player having just broken the block below them. First, let's go through the collision process. When moving the bounding blocks down, there's no collision with either block. Then, when moving to the side, there's collision with the bottom block, setting X movement to 1e-8. And then the game checks for collision with the top block, setting X movement to 0. Since the player collided with the ground the previous tick and collided with the wall, we can proceed with stepping. There's only one candidate step height, which is the top face of the bottom block, so the game tries to step up it by moving the player X velocity 0. Y movement is 0, so the game moves on to the next axis, where there's collision with the top block, so X movement is set to 1e-8. Because the bounding box doesn't move down during stepping, it only collides with the top block, not the bottom, so the X movement of 1e-8 doesn't get cancelled. Because of this, stepping yields a larger horizontal distance than normal movement, so stepping happens. Here, you can see the player should move against the block, if it weren't for the second 1e-7 check that happens after collision checks. Since the step height was the same as the player's original height, the final movement vector's Y movement is 0, so the movement vector is smaller than the square root of 1e-7, and the movement gets cancelled, so the player can step up again next tick and continuously have their movement cancelled. By abusing this, we can scale infinitely high using only 4 blocks. While floating, your server side velocity will increase, so you can pick up items below you. This is very similar to an infinite scaling method I showed in one of my previous videos, using lagbacks from client side crawl to float midair. But while lagbacks now reset your server side velocity in new versions, having your movement cancelled doesn't, so this method still works in new versions. Everything I've shown so far works no matter which axis you're facing, but there are some special properties when you're facing -z. An example of this is stepping up the backside of a stair. Facing any other direction it won't work, but facing -z you can do it. This happens because of the order collision boxes are checked during collision checks. In every other direction, the floor will be checked first, and then the stair will be checked. And because the stair is the last collision check, there won't be another check to set sideways movement to 0. But when facing -z, the stair will be checked first, since it has a lower z coordinate. So after colliding with the stair, the collision with the floor will be checked, and z movement will be set to 0, which allows stepping to give a longer horizontal distance than normal movement. When facing -z, you also don't need a block to step up when doing 1e-7 stepping. This is because you're able to step up the bottom face of the block. It's already found this also works with blocks like top slabs and hoppers. When the block at least has a top face with rim, you don't need a block to step up, but these blocks don't have a bottom face to step up. So instead of stepping up the bottom face of a block, you step up this imaginary step height, which is created by faulty code that's responsible for finding the horizontal faces of blocks. So that's 1e-7 stepping. Basically everything I showed in this video, all the discovery and research into this glitch was done by 1e-7, so credit goes to him. Huge thanks to him for answering all my questions about this glitch, and thank you for watching.